mucker James Price, former government special advisor. Mr. Price, how are you, my love?
I am very, very well. Thanks for having me back.
Gregg Wallace, I mean, I don't really know what to say about it, to be honest. He said some bawdy things. He's acted in a crude way. He's clearly that sort of uncomfortable man who, in a social situation, you just think, oh, someone shut up, Gregg. Tell Gregg to put a sock in it. Put a sock in it, not on it, can I just point out, according to some other fruity stories that have been reported. But it's, you know, the whole of Celebville have got their knickers in a twist over this one. What's your reaction to it?
It's taken a long time of me being on your various shows, Alex, and I think we've finally found a story that I have very little opinion on. I'm not sure I knew who this chap was. It's a cookery program, right? I don't quite understand why it is that my phone that's got the BBC notification app, not as good as the talkTV one, obviously, but that I've been told more things about what's happening with this bloke called Gregg Wallace than about the fall of the Syrian city of Aleppo, or about what's going on in the Ukraine war, or about what's happening in the economy, or the fact that Joe Biden has pardoned his son Hunter of all illegal activities for the past decade. Why? And the fact that the Prime Minister has had to be asked about this as well at the number 10 lobby meeting today, and the idea that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has to have an opinion on this story, just like us as well. There are so many other things going on. He seems like a bit of a prat, if you can say that. And it seems like any of these sorts of things, you would have the good common sense not to be so deeply unpleasant. And that if he loses his job as a result of it, I'm sure that someone much more talented will come along and take his place.
Right. I think that's a very good synopsis. Crass man, makes crude jokes, offends people, inappropriate for the workplace, loses job, end of. But it has become the latest sort of, you know, badge to wear, badge of honour, to talk out about Gregg Wallace. And he had that weird rant, didn't he, yesterday on Instagram or something, where he basically said, oh, it's a middle-class woman of a certain age. And I'm kind of like, yeah, you know what, Gregg, I don't like you. I think you seem like an absolute moron. But you kind of do have a point. If you went down a boozer in a working class part of the UK and there's bawdy humour, you're just saying, all right, whatever. But I suppose it was in the workplace, and there were various complaints that go back as far as about 2012, and the BBC did nothing about it. So any opportunity to corporation bash as well always sets things on fire a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely right. Anything to have a pop at the BBC. The problem is that you have something like the BBC has got such a power. It beams itself into so many people's homes. You have the TV licensing people who manage to threaten people all the time. You know, that awful stuff. They would lie to the public about there being detector vans with technology that could beam in and work out whether you're paying the license fee. Lying to people on behalf of the state broadcaster, I think pretty terrifying. And whether it's this chap Wallace, whether it's Gary Lineker, some of these people, and obviously the even worse track record they've had of some complete wrong-uns going back the years and decades, we won't go into now because it's too early to list some of the horrible things that have happened. But I just think that it's one of these things, but maybe we should be focusing, certainly politicians should be focusing on the bigger issues. We had this seismic debate only on Friday about things like assisted dying, and I get the sense that given that they whistled through all of that in 5.5 hours or so, with people being able to speak for about 90 seconds each if they wanted to, the politicians would be much happier talking about stuff like Gregg Wallace when the world is getting an increasingly dangerous place. You know, the government today had a big announcement about an increase in defence coordination and the fact that, you know, the world is getting quite scary. It'd be great if our politicians and if our other media people could get onto these sorts of topics and rather than silly old Gregg. Although, let's make sure that if anyone does talk about him, you only spell it with one G, because he seems to get very angry when people spell it with one G rather than two. And so you get a bit of a comeuppance for him, as he seems to have a nice thin skin.
There you are. I mean, actually, talking about these the strategic defence operations, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Sort of the government asking the private sector to show how they would keep things flowing behind front lines were there to be an outbreak of war. I mean, it does sort of reflect how dangerous the world is, and looking what's going on in Aleppo as well. Very hard to sort of unpick that one, isn't it? Because it's sort of like your enemy's enemy might be your friend. It seems to me you've got this offshoot of Al-Qaeda taking the opportunity. Now Iran is somewhat kneecapped, or their proxies are kneecapped by Israel, and Russia, who normally would rush to Assad's defence, are somewhat preoccupied in Ukraine as well, taking the opportunity to get a march on things. And I mean, can see who's backing them. People say that Turkey is somewhat behind this. One assumes that they're on the sort of, when it comes to the proxy wars in the Middle East, the Saudi side of the equation rather than the Iranian side of the equation. But it does show that, you know, we do live in an increasingly unstable world.
Yeah, absolutely right. Trying to get your head around what's happened there is incredibly confusing. As you say, you've got the enemy of my enemy is my enemy's friend, who's my enemy's friend, and trying to even keep track of these. Sadly, it looks like for a long time the West has been back in the losing side of the losing side in everything that's going on. But it does just go to show how much we should be backing our allies and building our own defenses as the world gets more confusing. We've got a few proper allies in that part of the world. Israel is number one. I think the Kurdish region of Iraq, we talked about this last week, I think they are increasingly good allies. The Home Secretary was there last week. And then groups like the UAE, even the Saudis, as they start to modernize, things happening in Saudi you wouldn't believe happening. You know, adverts showing girls not wearing hair coverings for the first time. You can walk down the part of London where I live and you'll see primary school girls being forced to wear hijabs, which I think is pretty outrageous. And yet we've got all these other horrible things going on in the world that we don't seem to have the resources to really match at the moment. We need to get a proper handle on our economics, proper handle on our own societies. And whilst we do all of that, we need to be building up our defense capabilities for the threats of the future. Iran will be involved in this in some way. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the mullahs that run that country hate every single person who is watching this today. They'll especially hate you, Alex, because again, you've got your hair uncovered, your face is showing, you're speaking your opinions. They won't like a woman doing that. And that's the nature of a lot of places in the world. And instead of pandering to them, instead of sending aid to some of these places, as we still do, we should be massively bolstering new, exciting technologies. I think when the MOD launched this big review today, they did it with drones from a European company called Helsing that are AI-powered drones. If we had a huge, great fleet of those, we could keep the country safe and then go and start, bolstering democracies around the world and keeping our people safe from all the horrors that are out there. That seems like a very, very good thing for government to spend our money and its time focusing on.
We're talking about some pretty dodgy parts of the world. Unfortunately, this is frankly where a lot of the migrants who get on small boats and cross the channel seem to come from countries who don't share our particular cultural mores, who might not have similar attitudes towards women and when it comes to respecting women. And yet, onwards we go. More than 20,000 have crossed the channel since Sir Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. You have to ask, what on earth is he really doing about this? Yes, I appreciate the idea of smashing the gangs. He's made a couple of arrests here and there. There were some Kurdish nationals who were arrested in the UK. I wonder if they had connections to this. We know that there is a significant tranche of people working in the people trafficking sector who might be connected to breakaway Kurdish movements. But when he talks about smashing the gangs, it's just not going to be enough, is it?
Yeah, I mean, we've just been talking about, exciting new technologies and making sure that Britain is firm and strong. And yet, despite having a huge, great navy that was once the most powerful navy in the history of the world, that kept the Armada of Spain out in the 1500s, it defeated Bonaparte in the 1800s, in the 19th century, it kept the Nazis from invading, is now seemingly incapable of keeping a load of little dinghies full of illegal immigrants from crossing over here. Now, even though we are a much diminished navy from maybe the heyday in terms of tonnage and in terms of, I think they call it displacement, don't they, of how much water the various ships displace when they're in the seas. But we still obviously have the actual physical capability to stop a bunch of dinghies from coming over. So why do they keep coming? Well, the reason is it's the thicket of laws and NGOs, of dodgy charities that tell these people how to get across, and all this sort of morass that prevents action. And it's the same kind of malaise, the same, frankly, deep sickness that we've got right across our state that prevents government from getting a handle on any of these things. You've got lawyers who turn up and say you can't do that, civil servants who come along and say you can't do that, various arm's length bodies that say, I'm sorry, that these international obligations that we've signed up to are more important than keeping our borders secure. And what happens? You come along, all these people now are crossing over as they're being processed, are put up in hotels and go around potentially, sometimes causing trouble, not necessarily unrelated to the fact that they come from very, very different cultures, and they are, by in a way, predominantly fighting age men. And those people and their rights to come and do that seem to be much more important than our rights to be safe in our own country and our rights to not have to have huge and ever-increasing amounts of our money spent on keeping them propped up in the lap of luxury.
Well, this is the mad thing. Talking about the world being unstable, we do know that, by and large, there are people who involve themselves in illicit international industries, and not just a few criminal cartels, but very often terrorist organisations. This is how the likes of Hezbollah make their money, through trafficking, and Al-Qaeda, all the sort of Islamist terrorists, the Wagner mercenaries. I say this all the time, but it's true. And as long as we don't do anything and there's still a, you know, supply and demand, as long as people think they can get to the UK, people will carry on paying these organisations and putting money in their pocket, the exact same organisations who want to commit terrorist atrocities on our streets. So not only are we potentially shipping in people with connections with these organisations, perhaps even intent when it comes to what these organisations' ideologies are, but we're also putting money in the pocket of these organisations. It makes no sense.
No, you're completely right. There's an old saying that the best way to understand how any organisation runs is to assume that it's being run by a cabal of its own enemies, and that was the only way that you can make sense of a lot of what's going on. Let's just stop and replay this for a second. We know that there are people who come into this country on small boats every day. You know, close your eyes and imagine this, and we have huge, great Navy ships. We've got a Coast Guard. We've got, you know, all kinds of guns and soldiers and scary blokes who could stop this. And they are not allowed to stop this because of various laws, various charity groups, various NGOs, and this whole morass of people, most of whom are paid with money that comes out of the earnings of people who are watching this program right now. That's money that you can't spend on your kids. It's money you can't spend on Christmas presents coming up. It's going on a bunch of people who are furthering the interests of those who have no goodwill towards this country, and in many cases seek harm to it.
And are using this in order to harm us quite deliberately. I think until people wrap their heads around the fact that this is also an act of war from hostile nations against us to destabilise us, sooner people come out and say that, the better. Now, talking about money and taxpayers' money, how insane is it that people on the top level of sickness benefits can now earn more than if they were working? An average of £23,900 a year. Now, I mean, one assumes that if you're raking in that much money, I don't know what the average rental price is for a property, but let's say it's, I don't know, 800 quid a month. I don't know what the regional sort of standards would be, but, you know, people are essentially sitting there at home, sick, with about, you know, 250 quid in their pocket per week to spend. It's not a bad quality of living, is it?
Well, I suppose it depends on what the actual kind of sickness is, right? I think that we all agree, even those of us who want the state to be much, much smaller than it currently is, both in terms of the money that it takes from people and in terms of what it actually does. One of the kind of, you know, what's the fancy Latin word, the de minimis, the minimal sort of thing you'd want a state to do, is for it to provide for people who can't look after themselves, whether that's people with really severe mental or physical impairments that are chronic and lifelong, or if you've been in a really terrible accident and you can't work for a while you get better. I think we all agree on that. I think that what makes people so mad is not just perception, but I think borne out by the truth of people who milk the system, who game the system. And I think there's this phenomenon that's been rising up on things like TikTok called sickfluencers. And these are people who get on there, they get their phone out like this and they talk into the camera, and they will give people tips and tricks of how to game the system. And what does game the system mean? Once again, it means taking money that the state is giving to them. The state gets that money, taking it out of the pockets of people who are watching this program right now. They could be spending on upping their mortgage payments. They could be spending on putting into their pension for their retirement, buying Christmas presents for you and me and sending them over to us. Instead, they get sent to people who don't deserve it and who sit down all day, whether it's on this, whether it's the people crossing over, and by the way, a whole heap of other areas that people leech off the state. Do you wonder why it is that we've got the highest taxes at any point since the Second World War, and yet services are crumbling? Because it's being tapped and sluiced and sucked away in all kinds of areas. areas. And we need to get a grip on this straight away. If Elon Musk thinks he can cut, what is it, $2 trillion a year from the US budget in 18 months without breaking a sweat or seeing any reduction, I think we could do a pretty good job of slimming things down in the UK as well.
Oh, we could go full on chainsaw melee, I reckon. It's amazing what's going on over in Argentina. James Price, thank you ever so much. It's really good catching up with you, my darling. Talk about people being on sick pay. I tell you what, I've dragged myself off my deathbed today. I got my Kleenex here because my nose is streaming, my nose, because I've been pretty poorly the last few days. And you know what? I'm a freelancer. I come into work because I need to. I enjoy it as well. I do love being here. But I'm sick to death, actually, of paying a load of tax for people to sit there and go, I've got anxiety, I can't go to work. And then even when it comes to physical incapabilities, if someone's genuinely unable to work, then we're the sort of nation that really must put our arm around people and help them. But there is so much working from home now. I just don't get it. I don't understand when there's the new normal of everyone can work from home, that we've got higher levels of sick pay than we've ever done in our history. A couple of your messages. Rebecca has messaged saying, and I think I agree with this, where I work, we all joke around with a bit of innuendo, but only certain people can pull it off. My friend at work is a cheeky chappy and says some real dirty stuff, but there's no intent with it. He's not predatory, he just says crass things and we all laugh. There's another guy, whoever, who is just sinister. And if he says anything remotely pervy, we cringe and recoil. And we've all complained about him at some points. He uses dirty humour to try and cross boundaries. Women sense intent, I think. That is where it is. That is where the line is. You know, don't you? You kind of get it as a woman when someone's just got a bawdy sense of humour and when someone is an actual creep. Now, I'd imagine, I don't know, but I'd imagine given allegations against a certain Gregg has gone back for well over a decade, and the number of people who have stuck their head above the parapet, I'd imagine he falls into the creep category. And the big question, of course, is why the BBC didn't do anything about it. But again, people there saying it's a dead cat story. Anyone who's left the house and watched one episode with him on TV knows exactly what type of bloke he is. That's from Betty. And Paula says, I'm not interested in the childish media storm over Gregg Wallace, a bloke being idiot. Wow. I'm more concerned about what's happening in Syria. Anti-Semitism in the UK, illegal migration, Saturday marches in support of terror. Ash says Nigella Lawson has made a career out of cheeky innuendos to camera and other people in cookery shows. Is it different for a man to do it then? I don't know. Probably.